This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I am going to throw an unpopular opinion out there. And y'all can let me know if you think I'm wrong. I think there should be a nationwide ban on phone usage at gyms. I don't know about you, but when I go to the gym to work out, I don't have time to waste. I want to get in there, get out in 45 minutes to an hour tops. I counted. There was a chick who literally sat motionless at the ab machine on her phone 15 minutes. Didn't use the thing one time. No, she just sat there. I was so pissed. Wanted to walk up and be like, the machine's not going to do the work for you. Your abs aren't going to get any more defined by you sitting there doom scrolling. But of course, I wasn't looking to get into an altercation. God forbid I get ousted from the gym for daring to speak unkindly to the female sex. No, trust me, if the roles were reversed, it would have been totally fine. Yeah. Phone usage in gyms needs to be outlawed. Trump needs to get on that one. Or at the very least, because I know I'm over-exaggerating here, if you are going to be on your phone, music only, like me. Put the Bluetooth earbuds in, play your music, and off you go. I swear, dude, I see stats on what the average American male and female looks like in 2026. It's like no wonder everybody's freaking fat. Even at the gym, everyone's standing around twiddling their thumbs on their freaking phones. It's not going to be during my lifetime, but somebody's going to research how cell phones have completely destroyed every generation post-millennial. It'll be a 100-year recap of the long-term ramifications of phone use, and how with each passing generation we've all become dumber, lazier, and more unfulfilled. Not that this is groundbreaking news. I mean, we've already known this for decades now. And you know what? I'm guilty as charged. I use my phone all the time for music and podcasts, the occasional YouTube. We've all become attached to these stupid devices. And it's no wonder, every time I walk out in public, especially young people, man, their faces are all buried in their phones. Nobody makes eye contact. Nobody engages in conversation. Everybody just looks so miserable and dejected all the time. It's sad. I've just grown to accept the reality that I'm better off doing my own thing and avoiding human contact as much as possible. I can't even go to the gym to work out for an hour without somebody evidently pissing me off. It's either people hogging the machines or stupid high school kids hogging all the free weights and benches. I think because I go there so often, there are people that kind of see me constantly, so like they know I'm there just to get in and get out. So they don't bother me as much. I think I give off those intimidating vibes. Like people know that I'm solely there to pump iron and that's it. So most of the time I'm left alone. Anyway, I guess we should get into some of the wrestling talk, right? It's been a great several days of sunny weather, so naturally all the kiddos are outside right now yelling and screaming to the top of their lungs. As kids do. But we're going to get into classic wrestling talk here. Midsouth and World Championship Wrestling. Make sure you all subscribe to the 5 Starr Wrestling Report if you have not already. We are the wrestling podcast no one knows but everybody needs. You're on YouTube and Rumble every week to go over the classic timelines. Things are... Well, I think I actually covered this on the Monday show. Summer's a lot more lax in terms of scheduling for me. So we might actually have more than a month of consistent reviews on this channel for both podcasts. We'll see, though. I don't take anything for granted, especially in the field I'm in. But let's dive in and get cooking with the recaps. So last week's show was built around the, well, not so surprising return of JYD. It was a surprise to anybody that didn't order the Capital Combat pay-per-view. We've got the upcoming Clash event on the 13th of June. And then after that, it's pretty much smooth sailing all the way to the 1990 Great American Bash in Baltimore. Sting's crowning achievement, depending on how you look at it. So this week was back to the 2-hour block, which meant double the amount of squash matches and boring green screen promos. We did at least get a semi-decent TV main event, which we'll talk about later on. Semi-decent up until about the last 2 minutes, when it totally fell apart. It led to absolutely nothing from a marketing or storyline standpoint, but it was still a fun match. We open with Brian Pillman versus Barry Horowitz, the world's greatest jobber. During this, they had Mr. Wrestling 2 on commentary to plug an upcoming live event from the Omni on the 17th of June. He will be the special guest referee for a Lex Luger JYD versus Ric Flair Arn Anderson tag match. And as soon as he mentioned that, my first thought was, why didn't they book that match for the Clash of Champions? Instead of the Flair JYD singles match that stunk up the joint. That's honestly all I got out of this segment. They did have a cool finish here where Horowitz went to try to dump Pillman over the top rope for the automatic DQ. But then Pillman did the skin the cat spot as Horowitz was arguing with the referee. So Pillman came off the top of the crossbody dive and got the 3. This is also my bi-weekly reminder of how much I still preferred Pillman as a singles over him in that Dead in the Water tag team with the Z-Man. If I'm correct, I believe that experiment was pretty much done and over with after they lost the U.S. tag belts at the pay-per-view. Or at the very least, I know they de-emphasized the push of the Pillman-Zank tag team, especially now that Ole took over with the book. I think a lot of that had to do with Ole not being a particular fan of Zank's work, which, I mean, he's not completely off base. If I were the head booker of WCW during this time, I would have probably done the same thing. Put the focus on the guy who was actually talented and could draw some money as a single star. And so that was followed with a Road Warriors inset promo where they called out the Horsemen for later on. That was what I was referring to when I was talking about the fun main event. We also had them re-airing the clip of Dog's return last week, when he showed up to run off Ole and Flair during their heated exchange with Rocky King. And, well, it's like we talked about the other week. It was Dog in the flesh. Allegedly all 312 pounds of him, according to the pre-tape promo they aired shortly after the clip here. I'm a little skeptical about that number, considering the state he showed up in here. He also mentioned in this promo that he was here to stay in the NWA. And you know, it's weird because when he said that, the thought did occur to me that JYD does end up sticking around for a bit longer after that infamous match with Flair at the Clash. He got de-pushed down the card drastically, but he was still around. Problem is, I don't recall a single fucking thing he ever did after the fact. He was involved in the whole Dudes with Attitudes feud with the Horsemen over the next several months. But after that whole thing wraps up, I have no idea what happens with JYD. Even though I'm pretty sure he's still technically under contract with the company for another year and a half. Maybe it turned into one of those Iron Sheik type situations where they just paid him to sit at home to run out the remainder of his deal so they didn't have to put him on TV. That would have been the smart move. So then we came back from break for Mean Mark Callis versus Larry Santo. While the match was relatively unnoteworthy, we did get to see the return of none other than Paul E. Dangerously. Yeah, well, he's back with no fanfare after he had been previously fired the first time when Flair gave him the pink slip for going out on TV and cutting that work shoot promo without his consent. And not only is he back, but for reasons that are never explained, and for reasons that I still don't entirely know to this day, it's kind of like the Oliver Humperdinck manager syndrome. Paulie randomly shows back up here in the summer of 1990. He's now managing Mark Calloway from out of the blue, even though Mark had previously been managed by Sugar Ray Teddy. And there was never any on-screen or story explanation as to why they broke Teddy away from him and replaced him with Paul E. Sort of falls into the same category of all the unknown covert reasons that Paul was inexplicably fired or suspended from WCW during his 3-year run. But it also explained why Paul was always randomly disappearing from television. At some point, he does end up basically becoming a full-time announcer with JR, and his managerial roles were pretty sparse from then onward. Honestly, though, your guess is as good as mine. To anybody that ever wondered, why in the hell was Paul Heyman managing Mean Mark for a brief stint? The answer was because they didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. Maybe to perhaps get Paulie to shut up and quit threatening the company with bullshit lawsuits for wrongful termination? Who knows? We have the Southern Boys versus Galaxy #1 and Joe Kazana. It was a match these two wrestled on TV a couple weeks back that I remember was pretty sloppy. I'm obviously referring to the Southern Boys. I think they had just debuted, so they were a bit anxious being in the spotlight for the first time. Here, though, they looked a lot more polished and relaxed. It's a fine little wrestling match. Good teamwork with Tracy and Steve. Cornette brought up here that they already have a non-title victory over the Midnight Express. So you can see the direction they're going in terms of setting the stages for that program later on in the year. They ended up going over with the assisted elbow drop. Not really much else to say about it. And that was directly followed with our very first on-screen look at Big Van Vader. God, this is so great. I love going back and seeing that old Japan footage of Vader with the giant Mastodon headset. Like, you talk about innovative looks and fantastic ways to make a guy stand out. That Vader entrance in New Japan is still some of the coolest shit I've ever seen. I'm not entirely sure what event they took this clip from, but love the visual of him going out there and chasing off all the fans through the aisleway. Now, they didn't do a full backstory promo or anything, just to wait for them to gradually introduce Vader to the audience before he makes his debut at the Great American Bash. The thing I always forget about, and again, this is stuff that's only now coming to mind that I'm going back and seeing this timeline play out. A lot of people might not even know that Vader's debut match for WCW was pretty much a one-off appearance. He showed up, he worked the pay-per-view, and then he left and went back to Japan for a while. He didn't really become a full-time member of the roster until sometime in early 92, I think it was. It was strange because I remember seeing them air all these clips of Vader prior to him actually debuting. He shows up and beats Tom Zank. I think it was Tom Zank. It was a 60-second squash. And then he's just gone for the remainder of the year. Then he came back later on in 91 and did a few things before disappearing again. Then he shows up in 92, immediately enters the world title program with Sting. And less than 3 months later, he's the fucking world heavyweight champion. Now, of course, his title reign was short because he ends up getting hurt and has to go away to get knee surgery. Then they went through a series of hot potatoing the world title on him like 2 or 3 more times before the year was over. By that point, the mystique had kind of worn off. But I was a big Vader fan for a long time. I remember marking out when they aired that first vignette of him before he debuted in the WWF in 96. I was like, no way, holy shit. Vader's coming to the WWF. And then, well, Vader came to the WWF. And as we've documented in the Retro Raw series, story wrote itself. He showed up and eventually ran into the proverbial obstacle known as Shawn Michaels. And it was all downhill from there. Now, the topic of big, mean, ugly, rugged professional wrestlers, that's probably one of the more appropriate ways to describe a talent like Stan Hansen, right? So, well, keeping with the theme of WCW booking throughout the Ole Anderson era, I guess it was only fitting that Stan Hansen would eventually find his way on NWA television at some point. Not that I'm trying to cut his nuts out from under him or anything. By this stage of his career, Stan was on more of the downturn as a full-time in-ring worker. I mean, he was obviously a big deal internationally if you know anything about his style overseas in Japan, which is why he adapted so well in that environment, because of the fact that he was so notoriously stiff. Understanding where I'm coming from as a wrestling fan, not having seen or not having been born when Stan was in more of the prime stages of his athletic career, most of the footage I've ever seen of Stan was when he was booked here in the States. I know he had that short Memphis run in 83, I think it was, when Lawler had brought in Jesse Ventura around that same time to revive the main event picture. I think Stan ended up working with, was it Dundee or maybe Austin Idol? Can't remember. I think it might have been Idol. The guy was a walk-in gimmick, though. Everything they showed with him in this pre-tape with JR, it was precisely how I remember hearing Stan Hansen cut promos 10 to 15 years before that. He was a super boisterous redneck cowboy who chewed tobacco, flung his cowbell around like a deranged animal, and literally just screamed nonsensical verbiage to the top of his lungs. An old school territorial heel in every sense of the word. Which is why Ole loved him. He was the embodiment of everything that made Ole find purpose in life. A miserable, grumpy old fuck who hates people and screamed at the clouds 24/7. Not to shame Ole either. Totally get it. Especially when he had to deal with a lot of these dumb fucks in the office around this time. But this promo was so great. You had Stan coming in and ranting about being barred from the States for being too aggressive and too smash mouth. Talking about how he fought overseas, perfecting the lariat as his finish. And how all these imitators here in the States have tried to use that move at his expense. But now he's back to wreak havoc and beat some ass. And of course, right before they cut away, you see him go to slam his cowbell on the ground as JR is trying to pitch to the NWA Worldwide tape, where we see Stan beating the absolute dog shit out of Paul Drake. Just killing this poor motherfucker. It is the most glorious squash of all time. It also gives you perspective when you see Stan working against an opponent who's like half his size. Stan was huge, dude. God, he looked like Andre in there standing next to Paul Drake. Again, very stiff worker. A guy that notably used to lay his shit in. Sometimes a little too much. But, hey, it fit the gimmick. He was a rough redneck brawler. He wasn't going to be going out there and doing suicide topes and have a coronas. I don't recall Stan being around WCW for all that long. Again, Ole liked him, which is why he brought him in to begin with. I think he was still doing crossover work in Japan during this time, so it was kind of like the Vader situation where he was in and out over the next several months. But I don't recall him doing anything all that substantial. Anyway, I'm going to try and blare through a couple of these next segments. Doug Furnas had another boring squash with the Green Shadow this week. It was a fine wrestling match, but nothing beyond that. Ross and Cornette spent the whole time putting over Stan from the previous two pre-tapes. Showed you how much they gave a crap. Then we had the Freebirds versus Tim Parker and Jerry Price. I noted the one spot early on in this match where the crowd all turned their attention away from the ring to acknowledge the fight that broke out in the nosebleeds. It was at the precise moment where Hayes and Price fucked up a shoot-off spot, so apropos timing, I guess. Paul Orndorff was back on the headset to plug his match with Arn at the Clash. He did his best to try to explain how this upcoming TV title match between him and Arn is months in the making. How he's been scouting film and preparing for this epic showdown long before the match was ever announced. It came off in execution like Paul was trying way too hard to sell this match like a big deal. No offense to him, but it was patently clear by the end. This is a total throwaway match that nobody really cares about. So Hayes and Garvin took turns beating up on Parker before they finally put him away with the DDT. I should also point out here that Hayes and Garvin are slated to wrestle the Southern Boys at the Clash. For whatever reason, I have it in my head that those teams had a series of matches over the next several months, and it was a fairly one-sided feud, meaning that the Birds pretty much dominated the entire program from start to finish. I think the Southern Boys win at the Clash, and then afterward they proceed to lose like 17 matches in a row to them on local live events or house shows. Ironically enough, at the same time they're about to kickstart the feud with them in the Midnights for the U.S. tag straps, the other tag team in WCW that can't win a match to save their lives. Funny how that works out. By the way, they also aired a Southern Boys promo after the match. Believe me when I tell you, it was as white meat babyface promos go. They let us know that they were a pair of good old thoroughbred Southern boys that loved wrestling, feared God, and were American by birth, baby. It was almost cringe enough to bring a tear to a glass eye. And then they completely flipped the switch with a goddamn great Horsemen promo. Moreover, a great Arn Anderson promo. He and Barry Windham were there to talk about the Road Warriors, and how in just a few short moments, they're going to prove that even though the Road Warriors have been one of the most dominant tag teams in the NWA for the last 6 years, they still aren't at Horseman level. Arn doesn't see that fire in Hawker Animal's eyes like he used to. He sees nothing more than a couple of human beings, and human beings can be cut down to size and exposed. Said tonight is the night where the Horsemen show up and proclaim that they are still the most elite group in pro wrestling. And just when I thought, man, good luck trying to top that fucking promo. Well, I actually probably shouldn't skip over Barry's promo. Yeah, Barry said a few words. They were words. It was not as good as Arn's delivery. But Flair's was. He was there to reinforce what Arn said and then talk about how today is the day where the Road Warriors learned what it's like to stay all night and stay a little longer. And I have absolutely no idea what that's supposed to mean, but I don't care. It was still a great delivery. This is like going back in the time machine and listening to old Horseman promos at Techwood Drive at the old studio. The glory years of Crockett Promotions. My oh my, where has the time gone? We then went to the ring for the Midnight Express versus Pat Rose and Lee Scott. Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention earlier, it was during the Mark Callis squash. I still like the idea that even though Cornette and Paulie are both heels, Corny still spent the entire match on commentary burying Paul and calling him a piece of shit. It was such good attention to story continuity. Even when they both play for the same team, they still have to kayfabe one another and talk about their mutual hatred. It was good shit. The Midnights took turns beating up these guys and finally put Rose away with a double goozle. Credit to Rose. Took a hell of a bump for it too. Sort of like he was dead. It's still an odd visual when I go back and see Bobby and Stan as a U.S. Tag Team Champions during this time. I mean, I know they were only champions for like 2 months before they dropped him to the Steiners in unceremonious fashion. But still, when you factor in how they've been featured and presented throughout the last year, them winning the belts from Pillman and Zank still always comes off like a sympathy call on Ole's part. Which I guess begged the question, if Ole made the ultimate call to have the Midnights go over at Capital Combat, if he had final say in that decision, why didn't they do a better job presenting them as a tag team on television? Other than Jim Herd getting in his ear and Ole not giving a shit one way or the other. More unanswered questions about all the drama going on in the office during this time. And a lot of the top guys just getting fed up with all this dog and pony BS. We had Tommy Rich versus Nasty Ned Brady, which I simply summarized as follows. Tommy won with a Fez press in an 8-minute match that went approximately 7 minutes and 30 seconds too long. By the way, now that I'm thinking back to last week, didn't they advertise last week that Sting and Tommy were supposed to be in tag action against the Horsemen? Did they just blatantly false advertise that, or did it happen on one of the other syndicated shows? Because I could have sworn, hand to God, they aired a pre-tape at the end of last week's show where they said Sting and Tommy Rich are going to wrestle 2 members of the Horsemen this week. I have no idea. Maybe they had second thoughts and replaced them with the Road Warriors because they figured that would be a better match. I mean, it made about as much sense as Sting and Paul Orndorff's follow-up promo with JR. A couple of the more standout moments during this little interview was Mr. Wonderful mentioning how Dog's return last week turned on a lot of people. Indeed. He also made a reference to wildfires and how, just like all the crazy hot stuff that happens in WCW, it spreads and only grows bigger. A rather odd comparison, if I do say so myself. And then Sting started yelling about obscure shit. He yet again kept name-dropping Attitude, and how everyone in WCW is adopting a new attitude as of late. He's also going to be at the Clash to make sure that the Horsemen don't get involved in the title match with JYD and Flair, to which I simply responded with, in hindsight, probably would have been a wise move to just make it a full-blown lumberjack match. The more bells and whistles going on, the better. But yeah, this promo was no good. We then came back for a Doom promo, which was just about as polar opposite of the Sting and Mr. Wonderful promo in every sense of the word. Meaning that it was great. Teddy Long referred to himself here as the Godfather of Wrestling. He compared himself to many of the great all-time black figureheads in this world, such as Martin Luther King and Booker T. Washington. He said the Doom can proudly stand here and proclaim themselves as the first ever black world tag team champions of a major wrestling organization. So I guess Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson don't count. And then Mr. Simmons, as Cornette referred to him as, basically called out all the tag teams and said they can sign their names on the dotted line, but they'll all be in for the fight of their lives. And that directly led us to Doom Squash with the same 2 jabronis that got fed to the Freebirds in hour 1. Some tells me that was a minor faux pas in the taping block. Or hell, who knows? Maybe Tim Parker and Jerry Price just decided we want to get our asses kicked twice on this week's Superstation program. And that is precisely what happened. Doom won in about 90 seconds with the modified Doomsday. And then we cut straight away to the Steiners pre-tape, where lo and behold, they showed some honest-to-God emotion over losing the World Tag Straps at the pay-per-view. They were actually somewhat pissed off. A stark contrast to last week, when they went out there to wrestle and did not seem to be bothered about getting fucked out of the tag belts. Rick called Teddy Long turkey neck here, which I laughed at, as did JR. Scotty talked about how everyone has their own way of handling business. When Rick and Scott won the World Tag Belts last year, they did it with class and honor, but Doom did not show any of that at Capital Combat. So when the Steiners get their rematch at the Clash, they're going to make sure they leave the new champions. All things considered, it was one of the better Steiners promos we'd probably heard up to this point. Probably because they actually had something to be moderately enraged about in storyline. Yeah, hold on. Let me make a note of that real quick. Rick and Scott. Great at doing promos when they're angry and mad. I will remember that one for later on down the road. But enough of this ballyhoo. Let's talk about the advertised TV main event, with Barry Windham and Arn Anderson going up against the Road Warriors. And you know, you can say whatever you want about the Road Warriors at this stage. Whether it was them totally not caring and having all but both feet out the door, we can certainly have a conversation about them being unmotivated. But it's almost incredible to think just how unfuckable the Road Warriors gimmick was, man. Despite every last attempt they've made to undermine these guys and make them just another set of bodies on the roster, exactly the way the WWF did in the late 90s, you would never know that based on how the crowd reacts to them. It's exactly the same conversation we had on the Raw review this past week. No matter how bad the booking was, no matter how poorly they were presented on TV, the people never soured on them. They still reacted to them like they were the biggest draws in all of wrestling. And you even look at a match like this. It's the prototypical Road Warriors match you would come to expect. You got Windham and Anderson out there bumping and feeding for these guys all over the place. Crowd's going absolutely nuts for everything Hawk and Animal do. Like, even when the Horsemen ended up gaining the advantage for a little bit to work over Animal, people are still passionately behind the Road Warriors. And I wouldn't even really consider this a great match in the pantheon of either Road Warriors or Horsemen tag belts. God damn, are these people treating it like a big deal? Now, I mentioned at the top of the report how it was a fun match right up until things got totally screwed up at the end. And I still don't entirely know what the hell happened here. I could flippantly chalk it up to Sid getting involved and just ending the conversation there. But I don't think I can even fully blame Sid for what happened. I think Pee Wee Anderson was the one who just completely blew the call. Sid runs an interference spot right in plain view of Pee Wee. And by that, I mean he got into the ring and started beating up on Hawk. And I think Pee Wee was originally supposed to call for the bell, but for whatever reason, there was a miscommunication with the boys because they just kept wrestling and doing spots. Pee Wee just threw his hands up and kept calling the action. The announcers had no clue what was going on. The talent had no clue what was going on. The fans had no clue what the hell was going on. They do a false finish where Arn was supposed to trip up Animal and hold his foot down while Barry went for a pinfall attempt. I'm pretty sure Pee Wee just stopped counting before he could even attempt to count 3. And eventually Ole and Sid ran out to force what I believe was the actual disqualification. The second disqualification here, after the first blown DQ. You also had Sting and the other babyfaces running out to jump the Horsemen and kickstart a brawl. When everybody ran out at the end, I kind of presumed that was Ole calling an audible on the fly and saying, everybody go out there and just start fighting. Again, I have no idea what happened here. This was a glaring example of them being given a finish beforehand and just totally being out to lunch. Nobody knowing what the hell is supposed to happen. I liked how JR and Cornette tried to justify the blown DQ call. They said, Sid did not make contact with Hawk. Right. So you're telling me Pee Wee reversed the call because Sid didn't actually make contact with Hawk, because he didn't touch him, even though he still got into the ring and made a scene right in plain view of everybody. So I guess it's the old handgun analogy that we bring up in wrestling talk sometimes. If you pull a gun on somebody in a regularly sanctioned match, you won't be disqualified. You actually have to physically pull the trigger in order for the ref to call it a DQ. Because that only makes sense via wrestling logic. I mean, that's basically the rationale that was being used here. Am I wrong? Good match up until that point, though. It's probably one of the last matches we'll ever see with Hawk and Animal on the Superstation before they leave. Arguably not their best swan song. But what can you do? And then that left us with Scott Steiner versus Mark Kyle in the closing match. I really wrote nothing down about this aside from Scott throwing him around for a few minutes and then going over with a Hurricane Rana, where he legitimately spiked Kyle on top of his head and almost killed him. No joke, I seriously thought he broke his neck on the spot. I think the only reason Mark Kyle was not killed here was because he was built like a fucking mountain. If he was 50 pounds lighter and didn't have such a thick neck, oh, he would have been offed. Guaranteed. If you can find this clip somewhere, you have to watch it. Scott gave him the Frankensteiner, and he spiked him on top of his head. There was no way for him to cushion the blow. A near fatality. Yeah, unfortunately, we were back to 2 hours this week, which, as we know from experience, especially during the Herd era, 2 hours of syndicated programming with nothing but boring squashes and 90-second pre-tapes. Not the most enthralling bit of television. You know, right now they're kind of in limbo mode until the July pay-per-view. You know, they're trying to keep things fresh by bringing in new names. Again, though, the problem is these names are all guys that were big deals in their own right about 15 years prior, also when they were in their prime. And while most of them could still go, JYD notwithstanding, you know, they weren't exactly talents that the WCW audience wanted to really see being pushed at that level. They still wanted Sting. Meanwhile, Ole wanted JYD and Stan Hansen and Paul Orndorff and, I mean, you name the megastars of the 70s. They were all there, live and in living color. But they weren't the guys that were going to help this company turn over a new profit. Well, we have officially reached episode 300 in the Midsouth tape library. And what does that mean? Well, nothing consequential. It was just another day at the office for Watts in the territory. We did see the Cowboy in action this week, which I guess you could say that was a special feature for the 300th episode of Midsouth Television. We'll talk about that in a bit. We began with JR and Joel Watts plugging local non-profit organizations in the area, noting that if they send in requests and postcards, they can get Mid-South stars booked at their local high school gymnasiums or athletic fields. I would love to actually hear some follow-up on this to see which local non-profits send in requests to get Mid-South wrestlers booked in their area. Yeah, I guess it wasn't so dissimilar from what the Von Erichs were doing in Dallas around the same time. You know, they were super big with the local non-profits and charity groups. Even if they weren't wrestling per se, you know, you'd still see footage of them meeting with kids at schools or local hospitals. Granted, I don't think that was their intent here. I think they were actually trying to get booked in some of these local venues for live events. So there was an ulterior motive. So that led us to No Cab, what may have amounted to the greatest squash match in all of 1985. And I'm not strictly talking Mid-South. I'm talking any territory. It is Cowboy Bill Watts taking on the Bruiser. Not Bruiser Brody, just the Bruiser. And if you didn't see last week's Mid-South review, I'll inform you here that the Bruiser was involved in a tag match wherein he pretty much exposed himself as being the single worst enhancement jobber in all of the world at that point. So when I saw that he was set to work with Watts here, I will admit, I kind of peed myself with excitement. Because I was looking forward to seeing how Watts was going to try to work with this ham and egger. I was just kind of hoping he'd stretch him and start doing the old Ronnie Garvin thing where he'd stick his fingers in his ears or bend his leg over his head so he could lick his own foot. Unfortunately, we didn't get any of that. What we did get, however, was still glorious. It was short. It was merciless. But it was still glorious. From the moment he and the Bruiser locked up, you can tell that the Bruiser realized that he had no breathing room here. He knew that if he screwed up one thing, if he potatoed Watts one time, he probably would have been killed for real. But the amazing part is that even though he was doing everything to make sure that he protected the Cowboy, I think this actually made Watts even angrier. He's like, come on, fucker. Put some meat into your offense. Lay it in. God, Watts is out there just smacking the shit out of this guy, tying him up in the ropes and doing these running splashes on him. Like, trust me, I would not have wanted to be the Bruiser here. There was no wiggle room. If he didn't lay it in, Watts was going to get pissed. But then if he ended up hurting Watts for real, he would have been equally as pissed. I mean, he won with the Oklahoma Stampede in under a minute. It was a quick little get-over squash. I guess we should also answer the question of why Bill Watts was coming out of retirement to get back in the ring here. The answer was to train for an upcoming fight with Skandar Akbar. Because remember, Akbar had been making threats to the Cowboy and vowing that he would get even with him for trying to suspend him and cut ties with Akbar after the whole fireball incident with Duggan. So this was one of their big draws leading into the summer. I did, for the record, go back and watch this match again. I promise you, it was still great on a second viewing. And then we came back for what they originally billed as Kamala versus Frank Lane. And just as I was ready to chalk it up to another generic Kamala squash, they threw a little bit of a curveball here. Instead, they had Duggan come out with a 2x4 to basically do a standoff and challenge Kamala to a fight. Of course, Kamala didn't actually come out. Then they ended up cutting back to the announce booth and moved on with a video clip from one of the recent Superdome tapes. For the record, I believe this would have implied that Frank Lane won the match via forfeit, though that was never officially affirmed. As far as the footage from the Dome goes, it is a match between Jake the Snake and the Snowman. But here's the caveat. They had Muhammad Ali make a cameo to be the Snowman's ringside manager for one night. Perhaps with the expectation being that Ali's presence would make the Snowman somewhat over with the fans. Somebody actually worth cheering for. I can neither confirm nor deny this is the case. I did pop getting to see Ernie Ladd again. That was fun. The edited clips mainly captured the high points. There was a lot of middle ground left out, so I presume it was a whole lot of nothing going on. What we did see prior to the last minute was uneventful. The Snowman's offense was subpar at best. Even with Jake in there trying to bump and sell like it actually had any impact. But of course, we get to the finish where the Barbarian gets involved to cause Ali to give chase on the floor. Meanwhile, Jake hits the DDT on the Snowman for a near fall, which is important because Watts tried to sell like a huge deal, noting that nobody has ever kicked out of the DDT before. Yeah, figures that they would try to give that honor to the Snowman, having him be the first one to kick out of Jake's finish. Of all people, you won't be surprised to hear it got over like a wet fart in church. And, well, the Cowboys said something here that I believe was to be interpreted as Muhammad Ali and his former manager, Bundini Brown, taking their jackets off to get involved in a brawl with Jake and the Barbarian. Let me play the audio snippet I took, and you can be the judge of what the Cowboy actually said here. There were two different interpretations.
Jake the Snake is again picking on Bundini. You see the champion, he's jacking off. And watch that right on the button.
Go ahead and chime in with your thoughts. Whether it was the jackets coming off or Ali and Brown jacking off, it was still a wild, chaotic brawl. Bear in mind that the reason for all this smoke and mirror nonsense was to try to get the fans to actually cheer for the Snowman. I mean, when you look at everything that went down here, by the end of the segment, he was kind of an afterthought. See, this is when you know a guy's not over and it's totally not worth any future investment. When you have to bring in Muhammad Ali to take all the attention away from what's going on in the ring. that point, he may as well just have Ali come out of retirement and have a fucking boxing match with Jake. In that case, it would have been highly more entertaining.
Champion is jacking off.
But anyway, moving on with things. We came back for Ted DiBiase and Dr. Death versus Brad Armstrong and Brickhouse Brown. Even though prior to the break, Duggan was still in the ring, refusing to leave until General Akbar and Kamala came out. So they go to break and come back. Duggan's just gone. Apparently they convinced him to leave somehow. And the funny thing is that Akbar was now in the ring, set to do a promo. And after Duggan made it clear 2 minutes prior that he wanted this fight, and he wasn't leaving until he got a piece of Akbar and Kamala, well, Akbar was in the ring like a sitting duck. Guess who didn't come back out to confront him? Apparently Duggan didn't want the fight so bad. As far as Akbar's promo goes, he basically told Duggan that as long as he brings out foreign objects to the ring, Akbar's not letting Kamala anywhere near him. However, if Duggan does decide to get involved with the 2x4, Kamala is going to use his patented spear as a weapon. And no, I'm not talking about the wrestling move. I'm talking about Kamala's actual spear that he comes out to the ring with during his entrances. He said Kamala will use the spear any way he wants. Which, well, again, we can leave that up to interpretation. I did like how he name-dropped the one-man gang here. There's a nice little teaser for future dates. Can't wait to see the one-man gang back in Mid-South with a totally new look. And as far as Watts is concerned, he knows the kind of allies he has, so he should be forewarned that Akbar will have his troops ready to combat said allies. And the second Akbar got done delivering that promo, he scurried the fuck out of there as quickly as possible. That was good. He said, I'm going to get out of here while I still have my head on my shoulders. Lord only knows when that loon bat Duggan's going to try to show back up. Then we got the aforementioned tag match I brought up a minute ago. I do not remember Boyd ever saying anything about this being a title match. Remember, too, this is coming off the heels last week when DiBiase and Dr. Death got into that altercation with Robertson the Barbarian. That awesome little heel versus heel brawl that the people were going ballistic for. They did a very poor job following up with that this week. But Duggan and Williams were back to being full-fledged bad guys here. And not to downplay this match, because it was great. The back and forth between both teams was phenomenal. Dr. Death in particular was really on fire here. After he legitimately got potatoed by Brickhouse and got his eye busted open. It was bad too. God, he really gave Brickhouse a receipt here. When he got control over him, Dr. Death was just laying into Brickhouse with these vicious elbow drops. He nearly took his fucking head off with a clothesline at one point. I would not have wanted to be Brickhouse if these two crossed paths after this taping was over. Funny thing is, I don't even remember what led to that. I think he just got overly excited and accidentally whiffed Dr. Death with a windmill punch. And he just so happened to light him up hard way. But they do some four-way stuff at the end, which led to Brad getting knocked out by Dr. Death's cast. Then DiBiase slapped on the figure four to get the pinfall, because Brad was already knocked out or knocked unconscious. No need to get a submission win there. This is one of those glaring examples of a wrestling match where sometimes matches can be 3 times better when a guy gets hard-weighed. Especially when you got a crazy motherfucker in there like Steve Williams. Just laying into guys and beating the piss out of everybody. A valuable lesson learned this week on Midsouth TV. Do not hard-weigh Dr. Death. Accidentally or on purpose. You will not like the end result. So then we had Hacksaw Duggan versus Larry Clark for approximately 20 seconds until DiBiase and Williams hit the ring to set up the angle, which is the more important part here. This was... Well, again, I think we've had this conversation in the last week or two. Might have actually been on the Mid-South review we did last week. Remember there was that promo that Akbar cut where it looked like he was trying to set up a fireball with his cigar, but then the cigar wouldn't cooperate, so he just gave up trying to do the visual and kept talking. This angle was another one of those deals where it was painfully clear that the timing was a bit off in the execution, so you could absolutely tell that they were trying to fumble around for a minute. So the heels hit the ring to try to restrain Duggan so Akbar could come in and tease that he was going to light another fireball in his face. And just to give away the payoff, because it's critical to the conversation, Bill Watts was supposed to come in with a chair to fend off everybody. And here's the thing. He did that, but there was also like 30 full seconds where prior to Watts hitting the ring, you see Akbar hovering over Duggan with his cigar, and every few seconds he's turning to look over his shoulder, wondering where the hell Watts was. Because, I mean, obviously Akbar's not going to actually set off another fireball in Duggan's eye. And so you get this thing where Duggan's trying to kick and fight away, and Akbar has to pretend like he's struggling to reach over with his hand to tease setting off this gimmick fireball. Meanwhile, he keeps turning around and obviously signaling for Watts. And I'm sitting there just thinking, at this rate, I think Akbar would be better off just kicking or stomping the shit out of Duggan. Because at least in that sense, it wouldn't be too severe to Duggan's overall well-being. He can recover from a few pussy ghetto stomps. See, Watts finally gets in there about a week and a half too late. He gives DiBiase and Williams 2 of the lightest, most ineffective chair shots you've ever seen. And albeit the people still went crazy at the end, it was not a particularly great angle when you look at how awkward the execution was. But to use a Dave Meltzerism, it worked in the room. So who am I to criticize it? And that set up the replay package after the break where they showed the Nightmare beating Terry Taylor on last week's show for the North American title. That was also where Ric Flair got heavily involved in the outcome of the finish, wherein he fed the Nightmare a gimmick to hide in his mask so he could steal the belt away from Taylor. And so we basically got 2 different stories unfolding as a result of that title switch. We have the Nightmare as a new champion, and we also have the further development in the ongoing Flair versus Taylor feud that they've been doing for the World Heavyweight title. One of those intermediary programs with Flair coming down from the Mid-Atlantic region. Obviously, that all predates the 85 Great American Bash before Flair had his title defense against Nikita. I think the Taylor-Flair match took place at the same Superdome show that they aired the Snowman Jake Roberts match from earlier. Don't quote me on that, though. They never showed the footage. That being said, we did get an answer to the question I asked the other week. Was Taylor still technically the number 1 contender for the World Heavyweight title, even though he was no longer the North American champion? The answer was yes. And as far as the Nightmare goes, Eddie Gilbert got on the house mic during Boyd's ring intros to inform us that he will now be referred to as the Champion. Put a lot of thought into that name change, I'll tell you what. So, the Champion had a quick squash with Mike Nichols. He went over in a few minutes with a sit-out pile driver. Assuming that the Flair versus Taylor match in Louisiana was a one-and-done blow-off right before Flair went back up to the Carolinas, I assume that'll put Taylor back in title contention with the Nightmare pretty soon. Again, I don't remember much about the Nightmare's run as a North American champion in Mid-South. I don't believe the title reign lasted all that long. But we'll see. So prior to the next match, they re-aired the clip of Dirty Dutch and Tom Pritchard beating up on one of the job guys with Dutch's bullwhip right before the Snowman ran out for the quote-unquote save. I'm sure Dutch was just peachy as a pig in shit getting the opportunity to work a feud with the Snowman. It was every heel's dream scenario in Mid-South circa 1985. So we got Dutch Mantell versus Alan Martin in a short TV squash. Alan Martin was doing all these wacky selling grunts here. Anytime Dutch would go to land a move on him, Alan Martin would let out an audible "Doh!" It got increasingly funnier the longer it went. I know I used to make fun of Luger for doing the same thing. He always did this weird thing where when a guy would go to hit him, he would audibly grunt or shout very loudly. That's what Alan was doing in this match. But it was more cartoony than Luger's selling noises. Anyway, Dutch won with the MX Gore Buster in about 2 minutes. And that left us with the Dirty White Boys versus the returning Fantastics. It has been, well, a hot minute since we've seen Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers in Mid-South. Last we saw them on TV, they were knee-deep in their long-standing rivalry with the Midnight Express. Now, of course, because we reviewed the world-class timeline from 1985, we know where the Fantastics have been for the majority of the last year. Them and the Midnights, continuing that feud down in Dallas for Fritz, which was practically the only thing they did down there during their bulk of the run. At least when it came to Bobby and Dennis. I think it was right after that infamous tag match they had at Texas Stadium with Whatsy Hoosie. Oh, what was the Giant's name they brought in to work that angle with Cornette, and then he completely fucked it up at the end? Was it Little John? I think that was his name. God, I still remember that horribly botched angle where, no joke, all he had to do was walk over and try to break up an illegal chokehold from Bobby Eaton in the corner. He still fucked the spot up. But they ended up finding greener pastures. The Midnights found themselves in Crockett Promotions. Fantastics wound up back down here in Mid-South for a brief stint. Crowd gave them the reception like they never left. Didn't have a ton of time to work with here, but they definitely made the most out of the time they had. Had a jump start with the heels where they attacked Fulton and Rogers before they could even get on the apron. That set up the Fantastics, making a big fiery babyface comeback for a bit. Bobby came in with taped ribs here, which not entirely sure what storyline related injury that was a part of. But the heels targeted that for a minute or two before Tommy got in there and kickstarted the four-way brawl. We did not get a finish because of the time expiration, but fans still went crazy at the end. Albeit the double team offense from Bobby and Tommy was not the cleanest here. There were some awkward miscue spots with them in the DWBs. Again, though, they were just trying to cram in as much stuff as they could, so choppiness was kind of expected. This was always a weird thing to me, and I don't entirely know why the thought came up, but right at the tail end when JR and Joel were hyping the return of the Rock and Roll Express for next week, of course, right as they reintroduced the Fantastics into the equation again, the timing of both teams coming back at the same time, that's a bit strange to me. People have made the comparisons between the Fantastics and the Rock and Roll over the years. They were kind of the interchangeable babyface personalities. So them being in the same territory at the same time was always going to be dicey. We've obviously seen it before. Normally, though, of course, depending on where they were in the different territories, but like normally if the Rock and Roll or the Fantastics were under contract or working in the same region, we usually didn't see them interact or even be around at the same time. Like normally one team would either be off television wrestling in a different promotion, or there would be something story related to where only one of the two teams would be on TV at a given time. And I think that was deliberately done because of the fact that they were so similar in both the ring styles and personalities. I always liked both teams. I was probably a bigger fan of Ricky and Robert if we want to get really picky. I personally enjoyed the Rock and Roll versus Midnight's matches more than the Fantastics matches. Although they were still both great all-time feuds. Certainly don't want to undersell them. But again, seeing them back in the Mid-South area at the same time, it's going to be a little bizarre. I know the Rock and Roll are still tied up in the World Tag title picture with DiBiase and Dr. Death. It would appear that they'll be continuing the feud here with the Fantastics and the Dirty White Boys. So they're obviously going to be preoccupied doing their own things. I guess I should also keep in mind, too, Ricky and Robert are about to leave for Mid-Atlantic pretty soon. I think within the month. So maybe they won't be on television together for all that long. Which, maybe that explains why they brought Bobby and Tommy back here, figuring that Ricky and Robert were about to leave. All in all, really good show. I love seeing the Cowboy show up to beat some ass. Chair angle with Akbar notwithstanding. They're obviously in a transition period coming out of the recent Superdome show. There's a lot of newer, fresher material coming down the pike. The big stories all centered around the Duggan and Watts versus Akbar and General Army saga. That's the main draw at the moment. But just kind of looking at the scope of where things are compared to even a month or two back, they seem to be hitting another stride. You know, we're still a little over 6 months before Watts rebrands the promotion after they go national and get the syndicated TV deal, which is also where things kind of take a downward spiral, as we found out historically. I still like to try to coin this particular time in Mid-South one of the golden years, arguably the final golden year. I still say Mid-South 84 is far superior in terms of year-long excitement and overall booking. Still, though, comparison to how most of the territories were doing around this time, Mid-South was basically cream of the crop in terms of regional promotions. Obviously, you have to omit Crockett Promotions and what Vince was doing with the WWF at the time. You gotta remember that. This was technically considered the downfall of the territories. What we're seeing in the mid-80s. I mean, yeah, there were territories still around, but the business they were doing at this time was not great. Memphis was on a downward turn. World class, good lord. I mean, we talked about the state of that promotion in 1985. Florida wasn't doing great. Yeah. Midsouth was basically your last stop. Anyway, that's all I got for this one. Good show. And this coming Monday, we will have the King of the Ring pay-per-view. I remember that this time. Not Retro Raw, just the 1997 King of the Ring recap. Like I said, I seem to be getting back into a flow of regular 2-week podcasts, so we'll see how long that trend continues. But thanks everybody for watching. Appreciate everybody that comes back to check out the show every week, and we'll talk to you all soon. Take care all, and peace.